Arabs who are going to work these hot houses. 3 weeks after the Israeli disengagement, all the hot houses were destroyed. I mention this not to cast blame or good or bad, but to show that the issue of economic advance, of practicality, political solutions, don't take into account the anger, the fury, and that's what I'm trying to point out with this story of the hot houses. Number 2, we live in our community of peacemaking with a great deal of illusions about dialogue. I begin with a historical anecdote. In 1906, Arthur Balfour, the English parliamentarian most closely associated with British support of a Jewish state in Palestine, and the author, or the originator, the author of the famous Balfour Declaration, which had earlier supported a Jewish state in Uganda, asked for, this was before Balfour Declaration, asked for a meeting with Dr. Chaim Weitzman, who was the first president of Israel, who was opposed, Weitzman was, to a Jewish homeland in any place but biblical Israel. Balfour pressed Weitzman as to why Uganda was not acceptable as a safe haven for Jews. In Weitzman's own autobiography, he puts it this way: when Balfour pressed me, I felt I was sweating blood. Then suddenly I said, Mr. Balfour, suppose I were to offer you Paris instead of London. Would you take it? Balfour stood up and looked at me and said, but Dr. Weitzman, we have London. That is true, I said, but we had Jerusalem when London was a marsh. He leaned back and continued to stare at me and said 2 things which I remember vividly. I'm quoting from Weitzman's autobiography. The first was, are there many Jews, Dr. Weitzman, who think like you? I answered, I believe I speak the mind of millions of Jews whom you will never see, and who cannot speak for themselves, but with whom I can pave the streets of the country I come from. To this he said, Balfour said, if that is so, one day you will be a force. Shortly before I withdrew from the meeting, Balfour turned to me and said, it is curious, Dr. Weitzman. The Jews I meet are quite different than you are. I answered Mr. Balfour, you meet the wrong kind of Jews. Weitzman meant that the Jews Balfour was meeting were wealthy, assimilated Western European Jews who are anti-Zionist, who are assimilatory, who wanted to remain part of European society and were indifferent or even hostile to Zionism. The bulk of world Jewry, particularly in Eastern Europe, was mobilized to Zionism and a return to the land of Israel. Now I come to our situation. We too, I think, dialogue with the wrong kind of Palestinians and Jews. We have conversation with like-minded partners, sharing our assumptions, goals, and pluralism. People on both sides who are open to compromise, and to a greater or lesser degree already detached from the core religious and national assumptions and loyalties of the traditionalist minority. People who are at home at international conferences are generally not regular mosque and synagogue goers, and are not anchored into the supernatural faith of their communities. We feel comfortable with these types, and they give us a measure of optimism, but they do not reflect the deepest longings, the deepest thinking and emotions of the vast majority of people on both sides of the conflict. It pains me, but I shall say it. Where are the Palestinians intent on suicide bombing at our meetings? And where are the Israeli spokespersons for transfer of Arabs from Jewish territory? They're not here. I learned that some of our sessions avoided the key, and I organized some of them. I learned that our sessions avoided the key issues in the conflict, and the warmest receptions were given to those speakers who were in tune with the peacemaking sentiments of cover. Sentiments which are laudable, but attitudes which only foster illusion and feel-good moralism, but do not engage in the core issues of the conflict. What needs to be done? I don't have much time, but I shall try. What needs to be done? Both Jewish and Muslim society face considerable mimetic envy and rivalry between secular and religious definitions of group identity, between different religious sects, between their own Western-educated elites and marginalized traditionalists, between the rich and the poor, and between those advocating violent reprisal and those counseling compromise on both sides. All these tensions, envies, and conflicts can and do lead to intra-group violence and civil war. Maintaining an ongoing religious war against the other side, in David Rappaport's words, is a stupendous collective deception because it provides satisfying sacred legitimation for violence which otherwise would threaten one's own group. Several authors, including my work in Sacred Fury, have shown how these Girardian insights particularly apply to the Middle East conflict. In times of war and bloodletting against the enemy, both societies experience increased camaraderie and solidarity. Alternatively, times of peace and cooperation between the parties have led to fratricidal violence. I just give you two examples. There's a study on the work of Vinay Javad about Amal, which was in the 1980s a very important so-called terrorist group or nationalist group in Lebanon, and Hezbollah. So long as the suicide bombings took place against the state of Israel, Amal and Hezbollah got along famously. For various reasons, it was American intervention. When this situation developed, the peace between the two groups ended, and there was fratricidal violence, killing between Amal and Hezbollah. And similarly, when there's enormous mimetic envy and intra-group tension in Israel, but when the wars take place, these tensions recede. I think we need to pay more attention to that. The Israeli Jews see, my last point, mimetic envy and Middle East violence. And here I want to encourage research on these points that I want to make now. Israeli Jews see the Arabs as a secure people living on their own land with great faith in a monotheistic God and a people willing to sacrifice for their land and religion. This has led Israeli Jews to enormous mimetic envy and violence and a desire to do and be as the objects of mimetic envy. The Israeli response from a Girardian perspective illustrates how the very nature of envy leads to the desire for killing and dominating the envied other. Quote, it's as if the Israeli Jews are saying, you think you are so strong and secure and have your own land? Well, we can even outdo your violence and determination. From the Arab side, there is mimetic envy of Israelis' culture's modernity, comprehension, and mastery of Western technology, and consciousness and the desire to imitate also leads to anger, fury, and the desire to destroy the envied model and competitor. The joyful responses to suicide bombings among the Palestinians and the outwitting of the despised but still envied other must be explained in Girardian terms. In other words, what I'm saying is the suicide bombers don't quite have a political goal. We have to understand them in another context. I conclude with a call for avoiding the illusions of much Middle East scholarship on the crisis and calling upon ourselves to develop a truly Girardian perspective to help illuminate much of the nature of the struggle. May I say personally that what mimetic theory has taught me is that the conventional view of land or orange groves or even keys to the houses or even politics as causes for violence and the Middle East conflict is deceptive and illusionary. The latent realities and motivations unveiled through mimetic theory yield a more accurate of unflattering portrait. I believe cover should be a force for reinvigorating scholarship and diplomacy and a new and penetrating perspective on this century-old but still lethal conflict. Thank you.
Well, I feel I have very little to say after Charles and Willy have spoken. They've really said the case that I would make myself. I have been at all the sessions. I've looked at all the papers. I'm reminded of an anecdote that a friend of mine told. Whenever